Kansas Territory, spring of 1871. The morning sky was still bruised with storm light when Noelle Lantry buried her husband beneath the open plains. The wind pulled at her black skirts as she knelt beside the mound of earth, her hands raw and trembling from digging. There was no marker, only a river stone she placed at the head. Her fingers brushed it once before she stood, staring out at the endless stretch of grass and sky as though the land itself had stolen him. He had died 2 nights before fever, sudden and cruel. One moment he was whispering about the Colorado passes, the next he was gone. She had shouted at him to stay, begged him to fight, but the sickness had swept through him like wildfire, and now she was alone. She clutched the reins of the mule, the wagon behind her packed with what little was left flour, 2 quilts and her husband's journal. She had no map, no direction, just miles of prairie and the wind howling through it. She did not cry, not yet. The sun was past noon when she saw the horseman, a lone figure on the horizon, moving steady. She stiffened, gripping the small pistol hidden in her satchel, but the rider slowed as he approached, hands visible, voice calm. "Ma'am," he said, drawing the reins. "You all right?" He was young, maybe 30, with a weather-worn face and a lean frame. Dust clung to his coat and hat, but his eyes were steady and kind. "I buried my husband this morning," she said, voice dry. "Does that sound all right to you?" He nodded once, not flinching. "No, ma'am." "It does not." She looked him over. His horse was strong, his saddlebag full. He had the look of someone who knew how to survive out here. "I am headed west," she said. "Colorado." He wanted to settle near the Blue River. "I do not need your pity, but I will take your direction." The man dismounted slow, offering his hand. "Name is Lyle Oakley," he said. "I can take you that way, but it is a long ride and not safe for a woman alone." "I am not looking for comfort," she said. "Not offering comfort," Lyle replied. "Offering safe passage." She hesitated, then reached her hand to his. His grip was firm, steadying her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I am Noelle Lantry." They rode together for 3 days, passing through grasslands and creeks, the silence between them broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the low calls of meadowlarks. Lyle kept his distance but never strayed far. He checked the wagon each evening, helped her set up fire, and kept watch through the night. Noelle learned he was born in the Texas hill country, raised on cattle and dust. He had driven herds to Kansas, fought off Comancheros, and once survived a winter storm in Wyoming by lying beside his horse for warmth. But he never boasted. Just gave the facts when asked, his voice low and even. She found herself watching him as he built the fire, the way he moved, careful, quiet, like he had learned early not to waste any motion. On the 4th night, the wind shifted. Lyle stood from the fire and listened. "Riders," he said. Noelle froze. "Wagon bandits," he added. "Seen signs of them a few days back." Her heart thudded. "What do we do?" He looked at her, serious. "You hide under the wagon. Stay quiet." "No, I will fight. You will stay alive." She did as he said, crawling beneath the wagon, clutching her pistol. She watched his boots move away toward the edge of the camp. Heard the low murmur of voices, then gunfire split the dark. She did not breathe. 2 shots. Then silence. Moments later, Lyle returned, his shoulder bleeding, but his jaw set. "They are gone," he said. Noelle crawled out, eyes wide. "You are hurt. Just a graze." She pulled water from the barrel and cleaned the wound, her hands shaking. He did not flinch, just watched her with that same steady gaze. "You saved me," she whispered. "I said I would." She looked up at him, her palm pressed to the torn fabric of his sleeve. "What kind of man does that for a woman he barely knows?" Lyle's voice was quiet. "A man who does not like the thought of you alone out here, or anywhere." The fire crackled beside them, and her breath caught. Noelle could feel her heart beating hard in her chest. She had not felt anything like it since before her husband fell ill. Lyle stood, stepping back. "We should rest." The next morning they broke camp. His arm was stiff, but he said nothing. Noelle drove the wagon, keeping the pace steady. She caught him watching her once. He looked away. They reached a small settlement by the Arkansas River that evening, a trading post, a blacksmith, and a clapboard church. They restocked supplies. Lyle let her choose what they needed, never questioning. When they sat by the fire that night, Noelle turned to him. "You said safe passage," she said. What comes after that? He looked at her, long and quiet. I have been thinking, he said finally. You are on your own now. I have land near the Blue River, not much, but enough. I could finish taking you there, but I do not want to leave you after, not unless you want me to. She blinked. What are you saying? He met her eyes. I am saying I could be your husband, not for pity, not for convenience, but because I have come to care for you, Noel, and I think you feel the same. Her lips parted, but no words came. Lyle stood. Think on it, I will not press. But I will not lie, I want you, and I would spend every day proving it. He walked off into the night, letting her breathe. Noel stared into the fire, her heart aching in a new way, not in grief, but in something that felt like hope. She had lost her husband to the plains. But maybe, just maybe, the plains had given something back. They left the settlement by first light. A soft, pale hush draped over the land. Noel rode the wagon seat with her hands wrapped firm on the reins, her back straight, her eyes forward. Lyle rode beside her, quiet, his left arm bound tighter now with cloth from a trader's store. The trail bent westward, following the slow rise of the land. Trees appeared in distant clusters, cottonwood, hackberry, stubborn things that clung to what water they could find. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The air was cool and dry, and the horses moved steady. A flock of cranes flew overhead, their silhouettes stretched and long against the morning sky. Noel watched them until they disappeared behind the hills. When she finally spoke, her words came low. I was meant to teach at a schoolhouse in Denver. My husband promised me I'd have the chance. Whitewashed boards, a potbelly stove in the corner. I used to picture the children's faces. Lyle didn't turn his head, just gave her space to speak into the wind. He traded that promise for a claim near the river. Said land was better than wages. I followed because I loved him. I didn't ask questions, not then. You still want to teach? His voice was even, but she heard the quiet weight behind it. I don't know, she said. I want to feel useful again. I want to make something that holds. They rode in silence a while longer. A pair of jackrabbits darted across the trail ahead, vanishing into the brush. I built my cabin with pine from the north slope, Lyle said. Floors still dirt, but the roof holds through snow. There's a creek close by. Enough land for a cow, maybe chickens, if someone knew how to raise them. Noel glanced at him. You planning to persuade me with livestock? No, he said. I'm telling you what's real. What you'd be walking into. She let that sit with her, the slow rhythm of hoofbeats filling the space between them. The wagon creaked as they crossed a narrow wash, its banks muddy from a recent rain. Lyle dismounted to guide the horses, his boots sinking slightly with each step. When they reached the far side, she offered him the canteen without a word. He drank, then handed it back. That night they made camp near an outcrop of weathered stone. The sky had cleared, stars scattered thick across the dark. Noel collected kindling while Lyle built the fire, each of them moving with a quiet familiarity now, like a rhythm had taken shape between them without either noticing. After they ate, she sat with her knees drawn close, the fire painting soft light across her face. Do you ever think about starting over? She asked. Lyle tipped his head back, looking at the stars. I think about what makes a place worth staying. It's not the land, it's not even the house, it's who's waiting at the door. She didn't answer right away. The flames hissed as a log split down the center. She watched the sparks rise and vanish. I was 17 when I married, she said. He was 15 years older but gentle. I learned to keep quiet, to smooth over the hard days. I don't regret it, but I never had a say in where we were going. Only how to pack. Lyle's voice came low. You'd have a say with me. She looked at him then, really looked. The firelight softened the lines around his eyes, but it didn't hide them. He had known loss, not the loud kind, but the kind that settled into a man's bones and stayed there. I'm not afraid of hard work, she said, but I won't be carried. His gaze didn't falter. I wouldn't want a woman who needed carrying. That night she lay beneath the wagon, wrapped in one of the quilts. She didn't sleep quickly. Her mind replayed his words, the steadiness of them. The trail stretched ahead, uncertain, but for the first time in many months, she didn't feel like she was drifting. The next day brought wind sharp and restless, carrying dust that stung the eyes. They wrapped scarves over their faces and pushed on. By midday, they crested a ridge and the land beyond opened wide. Low hills, the glint of water in the distance, and the faint line of the Rockies far off like a promise. Lyle raised his hand and pointed. My land's there, just past that bend in the river. Noel stared at the place he'd named. It looked small from here, just a patch of prairie, really. But she could see the shape of it, the way the trees curved, the fence line half-built, the glimmer of a roof in the sun. She didn't speak. Instead, she guided the team forward. They reached the homestead just before sunset. The cabin stood in a clearing, rough-hewn but sturdy. A shed leaned beside it, and a lean-to housed a battered cart. The fence was unfinished, and the grass had grown high near the door. Lyle dismounted and led the horses to water. Noel stepped down from the wagon and walked slow toward the cabin. Her boots crunched over dry leaves. She pushed the door open. Inside, it smelled of pine and earth. The walls were bare, but there was a shelf with a few books, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed tucked in the corner. A square of sunlight fell across the floor. She turned as Lyle stepped in behind her. It's not much, he said, but there's room to build. Noel crossed to the window, resting her hand on the sill. She could see the river from here, winding slow and silver. I don't need much, she said. Just a place that's mine. He stepped closer but didn't touch her. You could have that here. We could build it together. She turned to face him. There was no need for more words. She saw it in his eyes, the quiet offer of a life, not grand but honest. She reached up and unpinned her hair, letting it fall over her shoulders. The gesture was small, but it broke something open between them. He stepped forward then, not fast, but with the kind of certainty that left no room for doubt. His hand found hers, warm and solid. I'm ready, she said, and she meant it. By early summer, the cabin had taken on a rhythm that felt close to belonging. Noel woke before first light most mornings, tying back her hair with a strip of muslin and stepping barefoot across the packed earth floor. She would stoke the fire, set water to boil, and knead dough for the day's bread with sleeves rolled high and fingers dusted in flour. Lyle rose not long after, always quiet in the mornings, his boots slipping on without a word as he stepped outside to check the animals. They didn't speak much before breakfast. There was no need. The silence between them had softened into something companionable, something that waited patiently rather than pressing in. She had begun to learn the land, not just its shape, but its edges, its moods. She knew which trees bent toward water, how to read the sky before a storm, when to move the chickens to higher ground. One evening, after the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods and the air began to cool, Lyle stood by the fence line with a hammer and a coil of wire slung over one shoulder. Noel walked out carrying 2 tin cups of boiled coffee, the kind that left grit at the bottom but warmed the hands just the same. This stretch looks like it held, he said, resting the hammer against his knee. Might get another dozen posts in before the frost comes. She handed him the cup. You ever think about putting in a garden? He sipped, then nodded toward the south-facing patch near the lean-to. Soil's better there than it looks. Could turn up the beds this fall, plant come spring. I was thinking beans, maybe squash, she said. And onions if the ground doesn't fight me on it. He watched her for a moment. You've got good sense for it. I never got to plant anything, she said, not where I had a say. Lyle set the cup down on a flat stone and picked the hammer back up. You've got say in this place. She didn't reply, but her shoulders settled a bit, and she stayed there beside him until the stars began to show. Later that week, a rider came up the ridge, a wiry man with a red kerchief at his throat and a pack mule trailing behind. Lyle met him halfway, rifle slung low but not raised. Noel watched from the porch, her hands still damp from scrubbing clothes in the creek. Name's Harlan, the man said. Trapper, been running lines east of the river, saw your smoke, figured I'd trade if you had anything worth it. Lyle nodded. Got some flour, maybe salt pork. Harlan's eyes flicked toward the cabin. You two just settled out here. Noel stepped down from the porch. We're not looking to sell. The man raised his hands in a loose shrug. Didn't ask that, just figured you'd want word from the nearest town. There's a rail spur going in at Thompson Creek. Folks say the Army's moving supplies through come fall. Noel stepped closer. Is it true? Far as I know, he said. They're laying track 3 miles west of the old Spanish mission, might bring more folks through. She glanced at Lyle. That's not far. Close enough, we'll feel it, he said quietly. They traded dried apples and a pair of wool socks for a sack of beans and a spool of thread. Harlan left by dusk, his mule plodding slow behind him. That night they sat on the porch steps as the wind combed through the grass. Noelle held a lantern between them, its flame steady behind the glass. "Do you want to stay?" she asked. Lyle leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You thinking about leaving?" "I don't know yet, but I want to know if you'd come with me if I did." He didn't answer right away. A coyote called out in the distance, sharp and restless. "I came out here to be alone," he said finally. "Thought it'd be simpler than facing what I'd lost. Turns out it just made the quiet louder." She looked at him, her voice low, and now he turned toward her. "Now I've got reason to listen." She reached out and touched his wrist, her fingers brushing the skin just above his cuff. "I'm not running, not anymore, but if we stay, we build it right, together." His hand turned beneath hers and he held it, warm and sure. They didn't say anything more that night. The lantern burned low and the stars passed overhead, indifferent and constant. By mid-July, the first rows of squash were sprouting, green shoots curling upward through the broken soil. Noelle spent the mornings tending them, fingers deep in the dirt, humming low songs from her girlhood under her breath. Lyle worked the southern pasture, widening the fence line with cedar posts they cut from the ridge. One morning, he came in early with a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Found this in the shed, meant to give it sooner." She opened it to find a length of blue calico, delicate with a faded pattern of tiny birds. "Where did you get this?" "Traded for it last season," he said. "Thought it might suit you." She ran her fingers over the fabric, then looked up at him. "I haven't sewn a dress in years." He stepped forward, brushing a speck of bark from her shoulder. "Might be time." That night, she lit a stub of candle and stitched by the window, the sound of Lyle's saw cutting steady in the yard. The fabric took shape beneath her hands, thread pulling tight, seemed straightening. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And when she wore it 2 evenings later, hair combed smooth, bare feet on the cabin floor, Lyle turned from the stove and just looked at her. "I don't think I'll ever get used to how you carry yourself," he said, quiet. "You don't have to," she replied, stepping close. "Just stay beside me while I do it." He reached for her then, not hurried or rough, just certain, and she leaned in without fear. The wind moved outside the cabin, brushing against the walls like a hand over a sleeping child. Inside, 2 people stood facing each other, no longer strangers, no longer wandering. By late August, the air had begun to shift, less of the high summer heat, more of that dry, golden edge that whispered of fall. Crickets sang low in the evenings, and the cottonwood leaves had started to curl yellow at their tips. Noelle rose early one morning to find the sky streaked with high clouds, a sign the weather would turn soon. She stood on the cabin's stoop with her shawl drawn tight, watching a pair of crows hop along the fence rails, bold and unhurried. Lyle was already in the lean-to, grinding the blade of the drawknife against a whetstone. He didn't look up as she approached, but his voice carried steady. "Got word yesterday from that boy who runs errands for the smith in Thompson Creek. There's talk of a schoolhouse being built before frost." She crouched beside the workbench, brushing a bit of sawdust from her skirt. "How certain?" "They've already hauled in the lumber. Folks are offering what they can, blankets, sacks of grain in trade for tuition. No pay yet, but it'll come if the rail keeps pushing through." She rested her hand on the edge of the bench. "You think it needs someone like me?" "I think they'd be lucky to have you," he said, setting the blade aside. She studied his face. He hadn't shaved in a week, and the sun had darkened the skin along the ridge of his nose. There was a quiet pride in his tone, unspoken but firm. "I'd have to ride in twice a week," she said. "It's near 8 miles. "I'll ride with you the first few times," he replied. "Make sure the trail's clear. After that, you'll know it well enough." She tilted her head. "You always plan that far ahead," he gave a slow nod. "I do now." That afternoon, while Lyle hauled water from the creek, Noelle spread the calico dress across the bed and began stitching a pocket into the side seam. She'd noticed the children in town carried slates and chalk, and she wanted space to keep her own set. Her fingers moved with precision, each pull of the thread neat and deliberate. By nightfall, Lyle had stacked a fresh cord of wood beside the cabin. His shoulders were tight as he came in, but he didn't complain. She ladled stew into 2 bowls and poured cider from the jug they'd traded for in late June. They ate in silence, but it wasn't strained, the kind of quiet that belonged to people who no longer needed to fill every space between them. After the dishes were cleared, she sat cross-legged by the hearth, mending the hem of a muslin apron she'd found in the bottom of her trunk. Lyle leaned against the wall, rolling a bit of twine between his fingers. "Did you love him?" he asked, voice low. She looked up, startled not at the question, but at how long he'd waited to ask it. "I did," she said. "In the way you learn to love a man who keeps his promises, even if he never quite understands your heart." He nodded, not pressing. "And you?" she asked. Lyle's eyes stayed on the twine. "There was someone, years back, we were young. Her father wanted her married off to a banker's son in Abilene. Didn't matter that we'd already made plans. What happened?" She did what she was told. "I left for Wyoming after that." Didn't speak much for a long time. Noel folded the apron into her lap. "And now," he looked at her then, "now I speak when it counts." The wind picked up outside, brushing against the shutters. She rose and crossed to the window, fastening the latch. When she turned, he was still watching her. "I'm going to see the schoolhouse," she said. "I want to be part of something again. I'll ride with you come Monday." She stepped closer. "You're not afraid I'll want more than this place can give. I'm only afraid you'll stop wanting what you already have." She reached for his hand. His fingers closed over hers, rough and warm. She didn't speak, just stood there with him, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. The next morning they set out before sunup, the horses fresh from rest. Noel wore the calico dress with the new pocket sewn tight against her side. Lyle rode beside her, his rifle strapped to the saddle, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit, not fear. The trail to Thompson Creek wound through low hills and brush thickets, the path narrowing near a dry gully. They passed a pair of mule deer at the ridge, their ears twitching before they darted back into the scrub. As they crested the final rise, the town came into view. A cluster of structures around a central well, smoke rising from chimneys, and beyond that, near the edge of the new track, the frame of the schoolhouse only half-boarded but sturdy. Children played beside it, chasing each other through the tall grass while a woman in a homespun skirt called after them. Noel reined in, her eyes fixed on the building. Lyle pulled alongside. "Still want it," she nodded. "More than I thought I would." They left the horses tied near the mercantile and walked the final stretch on foot. The woman by the schoolhouse offered a cautious greeting, sizing Noel up as she explained the plans. 1 room, a stove for heat, benches made from split pine. They'd need someone by October if the weather held. "I'd like to try," Noel said, her voice quiet but firm. The woman studied her for a beat longer, then gave a single nod. "You're welcome too." As they rode home that evening, the sun dipped low behind them, casting long shadows over the trail. Noel's hands rested light on the reins, her back straight. Lyle rode in silence, but the look he gave her when they reached the cabin said more than any words. She dismounted and turned to him. "I think I was always meant to end up in a place like this." He stepped close, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "And I think I was always meant to wait for someone who knew how to stay." That night she slid beneath the quilt with her head on his shoulder, her body drawn close not out of need, but out of choice. Outside, the wind shifted again, cooler now, smelling faintly of dry leaves. Inside, the quiet held, not empty this time but full. The first frost came late. The river wore its morning mist like a ribbon, and the earth crackled beneath boots at dawn. Noel stood behind the schoolhouse desk, chalk dust streaking her fingers as a handful of children filed in with wind-bitten cheeks and calloused hands. They were ranchers' sons and daughters, farm kids with irregular attendance, but they came. They listened. And slowly they learned. Lyle had finished the second pen behind the cabin, one for the milk cow she'd bartered for with the woman who lived upriver. He rode into town each Thursday, trading wood cuttings and hand-forged nails for flour and kerosene. He never lingered, not one to waste words over counters or gossip, but he always returned with something extra, a twist of dried pears, a length of ribbon, a thick novel she might read aloud on Sundays. Noelle kept a small ledger now, tucked behind the flour tin, noting each trade, each expense. They had begun planning a second room for the cabin, something to sleep guests or possibly more. She had not spoken the thought aloud yet, but once, while folding laundry under the eaves, she caught Lyle watching the horizon with a look she hadn't seen before, not caution, but anticipation. One Saturday in late October, she came home to find him sanding a cedar cradle in the lean-to, the wood pale and clean beneath his hands. She stepped forward, voice quiet. "We haven't talked about it." He didn't stop working. "Didn't think I needed permission to hope." She sat beside him on the workbench, watching the shavings curl off his blade. "I was late last month," she said, "and again this one." He set the tool down gently. "You sure?" "No." "But I think so." His thumb brushed the back of her hand, warm and calloused. "Then we build slow, careful, like everything else." She leaned against him, the smell of cedar soft in the air. By December, snow had begun to dust the ridgelines. Noelle walked to school bundled in wool, her boots wrapped in strips of sacking. The children brought her pine cones and dried seed pods, little offerings for the nature shelf she'd started near the window. They called her Mrs. Lantry, and though she still caught her breath at the name, she let it settle into her like snow on branches. At night, Lyle read aloud by the fire while she stitched. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not. Once she caught herself humming and didn't stop. One morning, just after the new year, she woke to the sound of his voice low, tethering the horses with a gentleness that made her chest ache. She lingered beneath the quilt, warm and safe, before stepping into the day. After breakfast, as she wiped the skillet clean, she said, "Do you miss wandering?" He looked up from the hearth he was mending. "Not once," she smiled. "Even when the roof leaks and the cow kicks your shin, especially then," he said. "Means I've got something to lose." They married in early March, just before the thaw. Noelle wore a dress made from homespun cotton dyed with walnut husks, her hair braided with sprigs of sage. Lyle stood beside her in his cleanest shirt, boots polished with bare grease. The minister from Thompson Creek came out on horseback, and a dozen neighbors gathered in the clearing, bundled against the wind. They said their vows simply, without flourish. Noelle's voice wavered once, but Lyle took her hand and she steadied. Afterward, they served coffee boiled on the stove and sweetbread she'd baked that morning. There was laughter, some dancing, and a fiddle that played off key but joyfully. That night, she stepped into the cabin as his wife. He took her hand without rush, his eyes bright in the firelight. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. "You do now," she whispered. They lay side by side beneath the quilt she had pieced from scraps, the cradle tucked close to the hearth. Spring came late that year. The river swelled and the grass pushed up in uneven patches, but the earth warmed and the garden sprouted. The schoolhouse got its stove and a plank walkway to keep feet dry in the wet. Noelle taught letters beside numbers, and the children took turns ringing the bell. She gave birth in June, in the early hours of a rainstorm. Lyle held her hand through the worst of it, his face pale but steady. When the midwife placed the child in her arms, Noelle wept for the first time in years, not from grief, but something deeper, something whole. They named the boy Caleb after her grandfather. He had Lyle's dark eyes and her wide mouth, and he came into the world strong and quiet. That summer, Noelle sat on the porch with the baby in her arms, watching the wind move through the grass. Lyle worked the fence line, glancing back every so often. When he came to sit beside her, she leaned against his shoulder. "I still can't believe it," she said. He brushed his thumb over Caleb's tiny hand. "Believe it." "It's ours." They watched the sun sink past the trees, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rose. Their days were not always easy, the work never ended, and the weather turned as quick as a thought, but they were never alone. Not anymore. Together they built a life that held. One rooted in quiet strength, in sunrise rides and slow dances in the kitchen, in teaching and planting and raising a boy who would grow up knowing what it meant to stay. And in the evenings, when the fire burned low and the prairie fell still, they held each other close, hearts steady, knowing they had come through every sorrow to find something unshakable on the other side. Love. Earned and lasting. just as it should be.